researchers began to experience hallucinations in one of the caves, just from being there. A white shaman with a staff beckoned them deeper inside. Their vision started to darken, and people panicking screamed and ran for the exit. This happened to everyone who went in there. Scientists even found an explanation for this phenomenon. However, after that, no one ever returned to the cave. Hello, friend. You're watching the Curiosities channel. Today I'll show you places on our planet whose existence is hard for science to explain. They've existed for thousands of years, but they were discovered completely by accident by ordinary people. Today we'll dive to the bottom of a lake, we'll go inside a rock, and we'll find out how progress destroys history. Watch this video until the end, because as always, the strangest story will be there. Deep man-made caves. In 1992, a resident of the Chinese village Shixian named Wu An Huanan was convinced that the pond next to his house was man-made, although local legend says that it has no bottom and it's not worth getting involved with it. He bought a pump, convinced several neighbors to help him, and they started pumping out the water for 17 days in a row until an entrance to a huge man-made cave appeared underground. Then another one and another, and in the end, there turned out to be 24 caves under the village, carved out by hand more than 2,000 years ago. Ancient and primitive are not synonyms. The fact that it was ancient doesn't mean they didn't have the technology to achieve all this. Each one is about the size of a football field, with a ceiling as high as a 9-story building. The walls are covered with parallel grooves. All of them are the same depth, the same angle, the same distance between them. Clearly, someone did this intentionally. But there's one odd thing that archaeologists noticed. The exact same pattern was found on ancient pottery from this same area, over 2,000 years old. Someone deliberately copied the ornament from the pottery onto the stone walls. Who did this and why? No one knows to this day. People extracted about 1 million cubic meters of stone from the rock, which is roughly equal to the volume of 400 Olympic swimming pools. Where it went is unclear, because there is nothing near the caves. There are no piles of earth, no traces that anything was ever dug here at all. China has a unique feature. Throughout its history, the government has recorded everything in documents. Names of officials, harvests, floods, disputes between neighbors, everything was recorded. But there isn't a single line about these caves in 2,000 years of chronicles. It's as if they never existed. And now, the most interesting part. The caves were not discovered by a scientist or an expedition with modern equipment and funding. They were discovered by a single man with a water pump, whom everyone considered an oddball. And here's something to think about. If under one Chinese village there turned out to be 24 caves that no one knew about for 2,000 years, how many such places around the world are right now waiting for their own oddball? A place that causes hallucinations. In Khakassia, which is in the south of Russia, in the mountain range of the Kuznetsk-Alatau, there are caves that the locals call the gates to the underworld. And it's not just a beautiful name, because shamans have used it as a place of sacrifice for the last 2,000 years. Animal bones, remains of campfires, soot on the walls, and piles of human bones in vertical shafts, 20 meters deep, were found here. And all of this is documented. A find from the realm of legends turned into a truly eerie discovery. In 1985, a scientific expedition descended there. Speleologist Konstantin Bakulin, a man with many years of experience and dozens of challenging expeditions, described it like this. His legs suddenly became weak. He was seized by panic and terror, and before him appeared the figure of an elderly man in flowing clothes and a horned hat with burning eyes, who beckoned him deeper into the grotto. Bakulin reached for the safety rope. They pulled him up, and he was never able to descend again. After him, several others told similar stories. Several other scientists reported similar experiences. One of them recalled how his colleagues abandoned their equipment and ran for the exit, pushing past each other, even though none of them could explain what had happened there. All the speleologists and scientists who have been there say that if you stay in it for too long, you might lose your mind. The locals don't go in there at all because they're afraid. The scientists installed magnetometers inside and found that periodically, a pulse with exactly the same amplitude of 1000 NT appears in the cave. And according to neurobiologists, it is exactly these kinds of low-frequency emissions that cause anxiety, disorientation, and hallucinations in people. When the pulse appeared, the bats and pigeons at the entrance lost their orientation and began to fly around chaotically. So it's not a matter of imagination. There was indeed a scientific explanation for such behavior. The source of this pulse was never found. There are no generators under the cave, and geologists suggest a fault in the Earth's crust. But for now, that's just a hypothesis. After the study was published, all sorts of theories started to appear. Some claimed it was a forgotten military radar, an alien ship that keeps sending a distress signal, or a portal between worlds. The white shaman, who was seen in the cave, is most likely a hallucination caused by this radiation. Most likely. But the scientists who explained this never returned to the cave. If you remember how shamans chose places for their rituals, they always looked for something special. Caves with unusual acoustics, where even a quiet sound spreads throughout the entire space. Places where the earth itself does something to your mind. Plants that change perception and immerse you in an altered state of consciousness. In Kashkulak, this radiation causes hallucinations even in experienced scientists with equipment. Now imagine what happened to a shaman who came here intentionally in the dark after several days of fasting. He got exactly what he came for. He just didn't know it was physics, not spirits. A giant refrigerator. After seeing this, any viewer would be sure that nature itself is taking revenge for the damage humans caused. In the 1960s, Soviet workers in Yakutia cleared a section of the taiga for the needs of the nearest settlement. However, the trees in these areas served a very important function. Their canopies created shade that prevented the sun from heating the soil. There is permafrost underground here, and for thousands of years it remained untouched. As soon as the trees disappeared, the sun reached the ground. The ice began to melt, the ground subsided, and a small ravine formed. Today, that ravine is the Batagaika crater. It is 1.5 kilometers long and 115 meters deep. The area is more than 80 hectares. Every year, it expands by another 10 to 15 meters, and no one can stop it. The locals call it the gateway to the underworld, and if you look at it from the air, it's hard to disagree. But scientists are interested in Batagaika for another reason. Permafrost is a perfect natural refrigerator, and the walls of the depression have exposed layers of earth up to 650,000 years old. Animals that lived here during the Ice Age are literally thawing out from these walls. In 2018, they found a foal, a prehistoric horse, that was 42,000 years old with preserved dark brown fur, tail, mane, and internal organs. The animal looked as if it had just fallen asleep. In 2024, Batagaika gave scientists the carcass of a 1-year-old mammoth with the same incredible preservation. But there is a downside to this story. The frozen ground preserved both animals and carbon that had built up for hundreds of thousands of years. Now the ground is thawing, releasing it into the atmosphere as methane and carbon dioxide. From Batagaika alone, over its entire existence, more than 150,000 tons of carbon have been released. And there are thousands of such places all across the Arctic. They are all melting, and each of them releases gases that accelerate the very warming that melted them in the first place. Climatologists call this a feedback loop. This is Batagaika, a giant refrigerator. It all started when someone cut down a few trees. 70 years later, a hole the size of a small town continues to grow, and scientists still don't know where it will stop. 3 million years are at risk, except for the year of the carcass. The carcass. This is for destruction.
Кроме Йеллоустоуна,
Volcanoes and us on Earth.
огромные вулканы. И нам нужно знать,
And about them too. To the west of Naples, there is a creepy place where sulfurous steam constantly rises from the ground. The ground under your feet is warm to the touch, and sometimes it literally rises and falls by several meters, over a few years. This place is called the Phlegraean Fields, which translates as fiery land, and this name is fully deserved here. Beneath this place lies the caldera of a supervolcano, whose first known eruption happened about 39,000 years ago, and was so powerful that its ash was found in Greenland and the Caucasus. The scientist believes this eruption changed the climate enough to cause the Neanderthals' final disappearance. Ash from this eruption was found next to Neanderthal bones in a cave in southern Russia. In Roman times, no one really thought about the volcano, and they simply built villas on the shore of the beautiful bay. Julius Caesar, Nero, and Hadrian had their summer residences here. A significant part of the ruins of these villas lies underwater today because the ground beneath them sank due to volcanic activity. The strangest phenomenon that happens here is called bradyseism. The ground slowly rises and falls, as if it's breathing. In the 18th century, during the excavation of an ancient Roman market, 3 marble columns were found with traces of marine mollusks several meters above the ground, even though at the time of the excavation the columns stood above sea level. This means that over the centuries they first went underwater and then rose again. The land here lives by its own schedule. Around Naples and the Phlegraean fields, 3 million people live today. Italian scientists monitor the area non-stop, with hundreds of sensors tracking every tremor. The chance of a major eruption in the next decade is low, but not zero. New studies show that the risk of a major eruption in the coming decades is considered low, but not zero. New studies have shown that with each new cycle of ground uplift, the rocks become more fragile, and it becomes a bit easier for magma to find its way up. Roughly speaking, it's like a spring that is compressed again and again. When it will snap is unknown, but 3 million people live right next to it. Artwork that's millions of years old. In the state of West Virginia, at the entrance to a small tourist center, there is an unusual stone. If you look closely at it, you can see that its entire surface is covered with a perfect grid of convex lines that intersect at right angles and form identical cells across the entire area. It looks like a giant waffle. That's why it has such a predictable name, the waffle stone. For centuries, local residents have tried to figure out what it is. Native American drawings, traces of ancient reptiles, or messages from another world. The most popular theory was that the stone was left by aliens, because it's hard to explain such a geometrically precise grid any other way. People also love to attribute everything inexplicable to aliens. The explanation that geologists eventually gave is much more detailed and necessary, but it's no less fascinating because of that. About 300 million years ago, layers of sandstone were deposited here. Around 200 million years ago, tectonic plates started to move and cracks appeared in the sandstone. Then for another 100 million years, water seeped into these cracks, washing iron oxide out of the surrounding rock and mixing it with sand grains right in the cracks. This material turned out to be much stronger than the surrounding sandstone. As the softer rock weathered away over millions of years, the hard iron-rich mesh remained. Nature spent about 250 million years creating this pattern. Another piece of the same kind of stone is kept at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. Similar formations have been found in several other places in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. So if you ever come across a stone with a perfect grid and immediately think of aliens, just know that sometimes nature draws more neatly than any designer. But don't forget that it took nature at least 250 million years to create such a pattern. People once got weapons here. From the air, land in Norfolk, England, looks like a bombed field, with hundreds of round pits scattered across it. However, no war occurred here. These pits are 4,500 years old. They're mines. Grimes Graves is one of the largest Neolithic flint mines in Europe. In the Stone Age, flint was about as important as steel is for us today. It could be split into sharp flakes and used to make knives, scrapers, and arrowheads. But high-quality flint is not just any stone you find on the ground. It had to be extracted from deep layers, where the rock hadn't weathered and lost its properties. To date, 433 shafts have been found here. The deepest ones go down 14 meters with a surface diameter of up to 12 meters. From the bottom of each shaft, horizontal tunnels branched out along the flint layer to extract as much rock as possible. The workers used pickaxes made from deer antlers and shovels made from animal bones. They carved small recesses in the walls, poured fat into them, and made homemade lamps. Soot stains from these lamps are still visible on the tunnel ceilings. Imagine a person 4,000 years ago crawling through a narrow tunnel 14 meters underground with a homemade fat lamp, digging with a deer antler. These weren't primitive people, they were professional miners, just without helmets or pay. From a single average depth shaft, about 60 tons of flint were extracted, which could be used to make almost 10,000 stone axes. The mine operated roughly from 2,700 to 1400 BC, that is, at the very time when Stonehenge was being built. Then bronze appeared, metal tools became a status symbol, the demand for flint dropped, and the mines stopped operating. People of the Iron Age buried their dead in pits that someone had dug 1,000 years before them in search of stone. Today you can go down into one of the mines and walk through the very same tunnels that our ancestors walked through thousands of years ago. The soot from those homemade lamps on the ceiling hasn't gone anywhere in 4,000 years. What is Old Sarum hiding? 3 kilometers from Salisbury, England, on top of a hill, you can see the remains of walls that have been leveled to the ground. It looks like an unremarkable hill, but these modest ruins hide one of the most absurd stories in British politics. And British politics has had its fair share of absurdity. The hill was fortified around 400 BC. Then the Romans came and called it Sorvio Dunum. Then the Saxons, then the Vikings, then the Saxons again. In 1070, the Normans built a royal castle and a majestic cathedral here. William the Conqueror received the famous Domesday Book in Old Sarum, his census of new lands. Bishops and knights gathered here, and noble prisoners were held here. The city seemed eternal. However, some believe that Old Sarum was Merlin's temple, even back when the Tatars first arrived in Great Britain, fleeing the flood during the time of Atlantis, around 12,500 BC. England was then called Antal, and the Temple of Antal Stonehenge was built in honor of those peoples who perished during the flood. However, this sounds more like an alternative history, and it has nothing to do with the official history. But such a place had one problem that neither kings nor bishops could solve. It was water. Bringing it to the top of the hill was so difficult that local priests officially complained in letters. They wrote that during fasting, they suffered from thirst, and in summer everything around dried up. Also, the priests and the castle's military garrison shared a small hill and were constantly in conflict. At the beginning of the 13th century, patience ran out, and the bishops were allowed to move the cathedral to the Avon River Valley. People followed, dismantling old buildings for stone to build the new city. By 1322, the castle on the hill was completely abandoned, and the new Salisbury flourished. Today, one of the most beautiful Gothic cathedrals in England stands there, and this is where things get really interesting. Old Sarum was deserted, but on paper it was still listed as a parliamentary constituency. A few major landowners who owned this land simply made arrangements among themselves and named the people they wanted. There was literally no one to vote. But the members of parliament from the empty hill continued to sit in parliament for another 500 years, right up until 1832. For 500 years, 2 members of parliament represented land in parliament where no one lived. This is a story about how power works when no one is watching. How progress destroys history. Progress and development for some turned into misfortune for others. This was the case for the residents of Vilarinho, a Portuguese village that was 2,000 years old. People lived here back in the times of the Roman Empire, and 3 Roman bridges that survived to our days now lie at the bottom of a reservoir along with all the other buildings. Before the flooding, about 300 people lived here. They kept chickens, cows, pigs, sheep, and goats. The pastures were on the hills. There was hardly any arable land, so the houses leaned against each other, and the second floors hung right over the narrow streets. An ordinary, lively village that simply lived its own life for 2,000 years, until 1972, when a Portuguese electric company decided to build a hydroelectric power plant here. The village was in the way, so they decided to flood it. The residents began to be relocated in 1969. The last person left the village in 1971. The compensation for the land was 1 escudo for every 2 square meters. At that time, it was literally the price of 1 sardine. They paid slightly more for the houses, but not much. In anger, people stripped away everything, removing roof tiles, doors, and windows, leaving only bare walls. Half a sardine per square meter for 2,000 years of history. In 1972, they blew up the retaining walls, and the water swallowed the village. It seemed like the end of the story, but the story continued in an unexpected way. During a long drought, as reservoir water drops, house walls, street outlines, and bridge remnants emerge from below the surface. The village literally re-emerges from underwater, and people from all over the country come to see it. Former residents and their descendants gather here every year. They stand on the shore and look at the roofs of the houses where their parents and grandfathers grew up. Books have been written about Vilarinho, Several documentaries have been made, there is a museum, and there are children's books. The electric company has long been forgotten, but the village, which was paid for with the price of a sardine, has lived on in people's memory for half a century after it was drowned. It's sad to realize what was lost and to think about all those people who are going through this nightmare. They are forced to leave their land and their unique way of life. A kite-drawn cart, and there are inventions that were ahead of their time by just a day, so the world simply didn't have time to notice them. The Charvolant is one of them.
In Villarini, teacher George Pocock put his wife and children in the cart and drove out of Bristol.
It would seem like nothing unusual, just an ordinary family trip, except that the cart was not pulled by horses, but by two giant kites. Pocock called his invention the Charvolant and patented it after 2 years of testing. Two large kites were connected to the cart by a cable almost half a kilometer long. 4 ropes controlled the position of the kites. A special lever turned the front wheels, and the braking function was performed by a metal rod that lowered directly onto the road. No engine or fuel, just the wind. On that January day, the family traveled 182 kilometers from Bristol to Marlborough at an average speed of about 32 kilometers per hour. For 1822, when horses were the main means of transportation, this was simply fantastic and incredibly fast. Pocock also noted a special advantage of his carriage. In Britain at that time, road tolls were charged from horse-drawn carriages at toll gates, but Charvolant did not fall under this rule because it had no horses. You could pass through all the toll gates for free. Pocock was clearly a practical man. However, the invention did not become widespread because controlling the kites in variable winds was too difficult. And a few years later, the steam locomotive appeared, which solved the problem of speed much more reliably. But Pocock did not give up and continued traveling with his kites until the end of his life. He wrote a book about the use of kites in navigation and died in 1843. He was convinced that this invention had a future. A village clinging to the cliff. There are places that, when you look at them, you can't immediately tell if they're real or if you're just imagining it. Rocamadour in France is exactly that kind of place. The village doesn't stand at the foot of the cliff, and it doesn't lie on the mountainside. It's literally clinging to the vertical wall of the Alzeux River Gorge. Houses and churches climb up 120 meters clinging to the rock, and to the main shrine, staircases carved right into the cliff lead the way. According to local tradition, St. Amador found peace here. According to legend, he was the gospel tax collector Zacchaeus who came here after meeting Jesus in Jericho. He spent the rest of his life as a hermit in a cave by the cliff. Centuries later, when his incorrupt remains were found and rumors of miracles spread, pilgrims began coming here. Then French kings came with generous donations. And so, a village gradually grew up by the cliff. In the Middle Ages, it became one of the main stops for pilgrims on their way to the tomb of the Apostle James in Santiago de Compostela. It's no wonder that Rocamadour is called the French Jerusalem. About halfway up the cliff stands the Church of Notre Dame. It was rebuilt in 1479. Its main treasure is the wooden Black Madonna, which, according to legend, was carved by St. Amador himself. Above it is the tiny church of Saint Michel, dating back to the 12th century. And at the very top of the cliff stood a medieval castle, built to protect these sacred places. On the terrace in front of the pilgrimage churches, there is something that has nothing to do with religion. There lies a fragment of an ancient sword. Local legend calls it a part of Durandal, the invincible blade of the knight Roland. According to legend, the dying Roland did not want to give his sword to his enemies. He threw it from the mountain, and the sword flew across all of France and stuck right into this rock. Of course, historians don't believe this version. But the sword in the rock exists, and tourists keep coming to see it, just like pilgrims came 700 years ago to pray to the Black Madonna. This place draws people in, attracting them no matter what they believe in. Hollywood in the Clay Fortress. This place is worthy of a tale from 1001 Nights. It looks so cinematic that Hollywood just couldn't pass it by. This place is in Morocco, and it's called Eight Ben Haddou. Out of the haze over the scorching desert, on the southern slopes of the high Atlas, red towers made of clay and straw rise up. They pile up on top of each other behind fortified walls and cast long shadows on the yellow wall. It looks like a set from a fantasy movie. In fact, it actually became a set. Ait Ben Hadu was an important trading hub through which gold, salt, and all other goods passed between the Sahara and Marrakesh. When trans-Saharan trade declined in the 16th century, most of the residents moved to a neighboring village on the other side of the river, and the old fortress began to slowly fall apart. This went on for several centuries until David Lean came here to film Lawrence of Arabia. In 1962, he was so impressed by the place that he personally financed the restoration of several crumbling houses. After him, they came here to film Gladiator, Alexander, The Mummy, The Last Temptation of Christ, and in 2011 the Game of Thrones crew turned Ait Ben Hado into Astapor, the city of the Unsullied. Today a few families still live inside the old fortress, refusing to move out, even though the clay walls require constant repairs. Tourists come from all over the world. Tour guides talk about Game of Thrones, while the locals go about their business just as their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. The site is included in the UNESCO World Heritage List, and this at least helps to preserve its history. A drawing that can be seen from the sea. Everyone knows about the Nazca Lines, but few people know that about 200 kilometers northwest of them, on the slope of a hill in the Bay of Pisco, there is what is called the Paracas Candelabra. And unlike the Nazca Lines, you don't need to see it from an airplane. It can be seen from the sea from a distance of 20 kilometers. The height of the figure is 181 meters. The drawing is carved 60 centimeters deep into the ground and lined with stones. Its shape looks like a trident or three-branched candlestick, which inspired its name. Some researchers see in it the staff of the god Viracocha, a mythological figure of South America associated with lightning and the creation of the world. Others say it's a cactus. Others believe these are plants that local shamans used in rituals. One researcher with a vivid imagination suggested that the drawing served as a navigational sign for sailors who traveled to California for ritual plants and used it to find their way home. There is exactly as much evidence for this version as for any other. In other words, none. Some researchers found a mention of the Paracas Candelabra in the ancient Indian epic Ramayana, written more than 2,000 years ago. It says that the army which set out east from India was supposed to march until they saw the pillar of a three-leafed palm, a landmark visible from the sea to the east, established by celestial beings. Whether this is a coincidence or not, you decide. But if this really is about the Paracas Candelabra, it turns out that people on the other side of the planet knew about it 2,000 years ago. Ceramics dated to around 200 BC were found near the geoglyph, most likely left by people of the Paracas culture. But there is still no direct evidence that they were the ones who created the candelabra. Another mystery is that the drawing has hardly changed over thousands of years. Although it is not located in a dry desert like the Nazca Lines, but on a humid coast with fog and ocean winds, no one knows why it has been so well preserved. Upside-down houses. If you drive along the road past the Tunisian village of Matmata, you will hardly see anything from the outside. Flat land, sparse bushes, a few unremarkable structures on the surface. But if you approach one of the round courtyards right in the ground, you find yourself above a residential crater 80 meters deep. This is a Berber house, only it doesn't stand on the ground, it's dug beneath it. The Berbers first dig a round pit in the ground. This will be the future inner courtyard. Along its perimeter, they carve out side rooms directly into the walls. Sometimes these craters connect through underground corridors, creating hidden neighborhoods beneath the earth. Outside, it's empty, but inside, life thrives. The Berbers have been building such dwellings for more than 1,000 years, and the reason is simple. Underground, the temperature is stable. In the summer, it's 40 degrees hot on the surface. But in the underground rooms, it's 18 to 20 degrees. No air conditioners or electricity bills. The Matmata Plateau is located at the only land corridor between Libya and Tunisia. For centuries, conquering armies passed through. The Berbers first hid in the mountains, then returned to the plains, always remembering how to build homes upside down. This isn't poverty or backwardness. This is a 1,000-year-old engineering idea that works better than any modern air conditioner. In 1977, a film crew led by George Lucas came here. The underground hotel City Driss became Luke Skywalker's home on the planet Tatooine. Lucas saw exactly what he was looking for in these crater-like courtyards, a place that looks like another world. because it looks like no other place on Earth. Today, tourists come here for photos with the Star Wars sign, but the local residents who continue to live in the underground houses nearby didn't build them for the movies. Their ancestors dug these dwellings 1,000 years ago to escape the heat and invaders. They still live in them for the same reason today.
Yeah.
A cannon that fires by itself. Imagine an alarm clock that has no battery, no mechanical springs, and not a single moving part, and every day at the same time it lets out a loud bang. That's exactly how solar cannons work, which appeared in Europe at the beginning of the 17th century. And their principle is brilliantly simple. A magnifying lens is fixed above the breech of the small cannon, which at the right moment focuses a sunbeam onto the ignition hole. The gunpowder ignites and the cannon fires by itself. No person is needed, only the sun. Large versions of such cannons were installed in city parks so that townspeople could hear the shot and set their clocks. Small ones were placed on estates where a shot at noon meant it was time for lunch. Some of them were the size of real artillery pieces, and their thunder could be heard for several kilometers around. Wealthy landowners liked to make an impression. When accurate mechanical clocks appeared in the 19th century, sun cannons lost their purpose and almost all fell silent. However, one of them continues to fire to this day. It is located in the Swedish town of Åtvidaberg, hidden in a red brick tower by the lake. And every day from May to September, exactly at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a shot is fired. In sunny weather, the cannon fires by itself. If the sky is overcast, a special person whom the locals call the sun gunner lights the powder by hand, because a tradition is a tradition, and no one intends to break it. The cannon was installed in 1853. Since then, it hasn't missed a single day for 170 years. War over fish. In 1152 at the market in the Spanish city of Zamora, a fishmonger sold the last trout to an ordinary shoemaker. At that moment, a servant of a noble knight named Gomez Alvarez appeared and demanded the fish for his master. The fishmonger refused because the customer had already paid and the fish was his. The servant left empty-handed and reported to his master. The knight Gomez Alvarez took this as a personal insult. He came to the market with armed men and arrested both the fishmonger and the shoemaker, as well as everyone who stood up for them. Townspeople began to gather around. The nobility met in the Santa Maria church, locked themselves in, and debated how to punish the instigators. While they were in council, the townspeople piled firewood by the doors and burned down the church with everyone inside. Those who set the church on fire understood that they wouldn't get away with it, so they fled to neighboring Portugal. From there, they wrote letters to the king and even to the Pope himself. They recounted events, complained about the nobility, and threatened to remain in Portugal unless forgiven. The young King Ferdinand thought about it and decided that he didn't need these wicked fugitives on foreign territory. They were forgiven, but with one condition: to build a new church on the site of the burned one, beautiful and at their own expense. The church was built. It still stands in Zamora to this day. Next to it, there is a street named after that very scandal. Because of a single fish, a church burned down, people died, and a political conflict nearly broke out between two kingdoms. Aliens on the walls of the cathedral. The Cathedral of St. Antolin in Palencia, Spain, is the third largest cathedral in Spain and yet one of the least known. Most tourists go to Barcelona, Seville, or Toledo and skip Palencia. And that's a mistake, because on the walls of this cathedral, there is something you won't find anywhere else in the world. Among the traditional gargoyles with skeletons and monsters, there is one unusual figure hiding on the outer wall. A man in a buttoned cassock peeking out from under the cornice with a camera around his neck. A stone photographer on a medieval cathedral. In 1755, a powerful earthquake seriously damaged the building, and in 1908, architect Geronimo Arroyo began a large-scale restoration. That's when this character appeared on the cornice. Journalist Julian Garcia Torrelias established in 2017, after several years of searching, that the figure depicts Luis Rodriguez Alonso, a photographer and film director, a close friend of the architect, who made one of the first detailed photo reports about the Palencia Cathedral. Most of his films were later destroyed in a studio fire, and he is almost forgotten, but he is still remembered at the cathedral. And now, about the aliens. In 1995, another restoration took place at the same cathedral, and the architect Fernando Diaz Pines decided to add 2 new figures to the arch in the King's Choir. But the figures turned out to be unexpected. These are creatures from the movie Alien, which everyone had already seen by that time. Why exactly them? The architect explained simply, people have always decorated cathedrals with images of what scares them. In the Middle Ages, these were dragons and demons. In 1995, it was aliens from outer space. The logic is the same, only the monsters are different. So if you ever find yourself in Palencia and look up at the entrance to the cathedral, among the medieval stone monsters you'll find 2 creatures from a Hollywood movie. Tour guides love this place. Honestly, after all this, you start looking at things a little differently. You walk past some hill and suddenly you wonder if there's something inside. You see an old reservoir, and maybe there's a flooded city at the bottom. You look at the walls of a medieval cathedral, and there are aliens from a Hollywood movie. All in all, the world is clearly more interesting than what we were told in school. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because a new video is coming soon.